Ethan Graves never thought he'd come back to Blackwood. 15 years was a long time to be away, but not long enough to forget why he left. The town had always felt like a place suspended in time, stuck in the past, rotting at the edges. The kind of place where old grudges and family secrets ran deeper than the roots of the ancient oaks that lined Main Street. It wasn't that Blackwood was unfriendly. No, that would have been easier to handle. The problem was that it was too friendly, too small, too suffocating. And now, standing outside his childhood home with a suitcase in one hand and a key in the other, Ethan wondered why it didn't feel like home at all. The house was a modest two-story colonial, white paint peeling from the shutters, the porch sagging under the weight of too many brutal Maine winters. His mother had lived here alone for the last decade, refusing to leave even after his father died. Now, she was gone too. A heart attack, according to the coroner. The neighbors found her slumped over in the garden, one hand clutching a trowel, the other grasping at something unseen. The thought unsettled him. Ethan let out a breath and turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open, exhaling the scent of dust and forgotten memories. Inside, the air was thick, stale. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting strange, shifting patterns on the wooden floor. Everything was exactly as he remembered. His mother's collection of ceramic owls lining the shelves, the grandfather clock in the corner that hadn't ticked in years, the frayed floral couch where she used to sit, sipping tea and watching the news. He set his suitcase down by the stairs, rubbing his temple. The headache had started somewhere around the outskirts of town and hadn't let up since. He chalked it up to exhaustion. A sudden knock at the door made him jump. Ethan turned, frowning. He wasn't expecting visitors. Hesitating, he pulled the door open. A woman stood on the porch, her face vaguely familiar. Dark red hair, sharp green eyes, a smirk that seemed both playful and guarded. She wore a leather jacket over a Blackwood Diner t-shirt. "Ethan Graves," she said, crossing her arms. "I'll be damned." Ethan blinked. "Oh yeah, that's me." The woman let out a short laugh. "You really don't remember me, do you?" He studied her face, something tugging at the edges of his mind. Then it clicked. Harper Lane. There it is. She grinned. "Took you long enough." Harper had been a few years younger than him in school. He remembered her as the kid who always had a smart remark, the one who never quite fit in, but never seemed to care. Last he heard, she had skipped town after high school, same as him. "You still live here?" Ethan asked. Unfortunately, Harper leaned against the doorframe. "I work at the Rusty Anchor, bartending mostly." Ethan smirked. "Didn't peg you for the stay in Blackwood forever type." "Yeah, well, life's funny like that. I heard you were back. Figured I'd stop by and say hi." Ethan hesitated. Something about the way she said it. "I heard you were back" felt off. "From home." Before he could ask, Harper cleared her throat. "Sorry about your mom. By the way, she was nice." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, thanks." There was an awkward pause before Harper shoved her hands into her jacket pockets. "Listen, while you're in town, do yourself a favor. Don't go asking too many questions." Ethan frowned. "Questions about what? Just trust me, okay?" She shifted on her feet, glancing over her shoulder like someone might be watching. "Blackwood's not the same place you left." That didn't sit well with him. "Harper, what's going on?" She shook her head. "Forget it. Just be careful, Graves." And with that, she turned and walked off the porch, disappearing down the street before he could stop her. Ethan watched her go, a chill creeping up his spine. What the hell was that about? Later that night, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a pile of old mail his mother never got around to opening. Bills, newsletters, junk. The house was too quiet. A glass of whiskey sat untouched beside him. He wasn't much of a drinker, but something about being back in this house made him want to crawl out of his own skin. He picked up an envelope, brow furrowing at the unfamiliar handwriting. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper. "Do you remember Daniel Whitaker?" Ethan's stomach dropped. Of course, he remembered Daniel. They had been best friends, inseparable since childhood. Exploring the woods behind the old mill, daring each other to sneak into the abandoned church on Hollow Street, staying up late playing video games in Daniel's basement. And then what? Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, a sudden wave of nausea hitting him. Something was missing. He could see Daniel's face in his mind, but the details were wrong. Blurry. His laugh, his voice, gone, like a radio station fading into static. He gripped the edge of the table, breathing heavily. What the hell was happening to him? A knock at the door snapped him out of it. Slowly, Ethan stood, heart pounding. The house felt colder now, the shadows stretching longer. He walked to the door, hesitated, then pulled it open. No one was there, just the thick Maine fog rolling in across the empty street. And on the porch, where no one had been standing, was another envelope. Ethan bent down, hand trembling as he picked it up. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. It showed two boys, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One of them was Ethan. The other was a faceless void, a space where someone should have been. The caption scrawled at the bottom in shaky handwriting. Dio, you remember him? Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His vision blurred. A sharp pain lanced through his skull, like something was being ripped out of him. And for the briefest, most terrifying second, he couldn't remember his own name. Ethan woke to the sound of something scratching against his bedroom window. For a moment, he was disoriented. The room was pitch black, the air thick and heavy. He wasn't used to the silence. Boston was never this quiet. But here, in his mother's old house, the quiet pressed down on him like a weight. The scratching came again. His pulse quickened. He sat up, heart hammering, and turned toward the window. The fog outside was thick, swirling like living smoke. For a split second, he thought he saw a shape standing in it, a tall, thin figure watching him. Then it was gone. Ethan let out a breath and ran a hand down his face. Just the wind, just the damn fog. But his fingers brushed across something damp on his forehead. Blood. His nose had been bleeding. That hadn't happened since he was a kid. Unease curled in his stomach as he stumbled out of bed and into the bathroom. The fluorescent light flickered on, casting a sickly glow over his reflection. He leaned over the sink, splashing cold water on his face, and stared at himself in the mirror. He looked exhausted. Pale skin, dark circles under his eyes. But something else was wrong. His reflection seemed slower, like there was a fraction of a second between his movements and the mirror catching up. A trick of the light. He shut the mirror cabinet and turned away. That was when he saw it. The Polaroid from last night sat on the bathroom counter. He was sure he'd left it in the kitchen. His fingers trembled as he picked it up, staring at the faded image. His own young face smiled back at him. But the space where Daniel should have been was still empty. A void, a hole in reality. Ethan flipped the picture over. More handwriting. You have to remember. A shiver ran down his spine. Ethan walked into Blackwood's public library later that morning, his breath fogging in the cold air. He had one goal: find proof that Daniel Whitaker existed. He needed to believe that his memories were real, that he wasn't losing his mind. The library smelled like old paper and dust. The scent of childhood afternoons spent hiding between the shelves while his mother worked. It hadn't changed much. The same worn-out carpet, the same flickering overhead lights. The librarian, Mrs. Tinsley, sat behind the front desk, peering at him over her bifocals. She had been ancient when he was a kid, and somehow she was still here. Well, I'll be, she said, squinting. Ethan Graves, I heard you were back. He forced a smile. Seems like everyone has. Small town, she said with a shrug. What can I do for you? I'm looking for old yearbooks, Ethan said, from when I was in school. Mrs. Tinsley frowned. Yearbooks? Yeah, Blackwood High, early 2000s. She hesitated, then nodded. They should be in the archives. She gestured toward the back room. Ethan thanked her and headed for the dusty shelves of bound yearbooks. He ran his fingers along their cracked spines, pulling out the ones from his high school years. He flipped to the pages of class photos, scanning row after row of familiar faces. And then he saw it, or rather, he didn't see it. Daniel Whitaker was missing. His name wasn't in the captions. His picture wasn't anywhere, like he had never existed. Ethan's throat went dry. This wasn't possible. He turned the pages frantically, searching for any mention of Daniel. But there was nothing. No sports teams, no club photos, no signatures scrawled in the back. But Ethan remembered him, didn't he? His vision blurred. The headache from last night returned, pounding behind his eyes. He gripped the edge of the table, his breath coming fast. Something wrong. Ethan snapped his head up. Harper stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He swallowed hard. You ever hear the name Daniel Whitaker? She didn't react immediately. Instead, she watched him carefully, like she was trying to decide how much to say. Finally, she sighed. Not here. The Rusty Anchor was the kind of bar where secrets got drowned in cheap whiskey and no one asked too many questions. Ethan followed Harper inside, the warm scent of old wood and beer filling his lungs. A few regulars sat hunched over their drinks, and a jukebox in the corner played something slow and melancholic. Harper poured herself a drink and gestured for Ethan to sit. You're asking dangerous questions, she said, swirling the amber liquid in her glass. Ethan leaned forward. So you do remember Daniel? She hesitated, then nodded. You do, but most people don't. Ethan's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Harper exhaled slowly. People vanish in this town, Ethan, but not like normal disappearances. They don't just go missing. They get erased. Ethan's skin prickled. That's not possible. She gave him a grim look. Then tell me this. Why can't you find Daniel in your yearbooks? Why doesn't anyone else remember him? Why do you have a photo of someone who's not there? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Harper leaned in. We call them the hollow ones. Ethan swallowed. The hell does that mean? They take people, graves, not just their bodies, their existence. They erase them from memories, from records, from everything. The more you try to remember them, the more they come for you. Ethan's breath came shallow. The Polaroid, the headaches, the way his own memories were starting to blur at the edges. A cold dread settled in his stomach. How do you stop it? He asked. Harper stared into her drink. You don't. That night, Ethan sat in his car outside the Whitaker house. Or at least, what should have been the Whitaker house. The last time he saw it, it had been a small blue 2-story home, the front porch sagging, a rusted-out pickup in the driveway. But now, the lot was empty. No house, no driveway, no sign that anyone had ever lived there, like it had never been there at all. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. Something moved in the fog, a shadow, shifting just beyond the streetlight's reach. His breath caught as the figure stepped forward. It was tall, thin, its limbs were too long, its face an empty blur, like someone had smudged it out of reality. A hollow one. Ethan's vision swam. His head throbbed. The thing tilted its head like it was studying him. And then, in a voice that was both distant and impossibly close, it whispered his name. Ethan stumbled backward, gasping for air. His vision blurred, his thoughts fraying like old rope. For a second, just a second, he forgot where he was. Then he turned and ran. The fog swallowed the street behind him. And in the silence, something laughed. Ethan didn't stop running until he was back inside his mother's house. The door slammed shut and bolted behind him. His lungs burned. His hands shook as he pressed them against the door, listening. Silence. No footsteps. No whispers. Just a faint rustle of trees in the wind. Had he imagined it? No. He had seen something out there. Something wrong. It had stood in the fog, faceless, whispering his name. A hollow one. Harper's words from earlier echoed in his head. They don't just take people. They take their existence. Ethan closed his eyes and focused on his breathing. In, out, in, out. His mind was unraveling. His own memories, Daniel, the old house that no longer existed, the people no one else seemed to remember, were slipping away. The harder he held on to them, the more they frayed, like trying to clutch smoke in his fists. He turned and staggered into the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of water with shaking hands. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was happening before he forgot everything. The next morning, Ethan found himself at Blackwood Historical Society, an old brick building tucked between a bookstore and the town's tiny post office. If official records existed anywhere, it would be here. The place smelled of old paper and mildew, dust motes dancing in the dim light. A lone desk sat at the front, occupied by a balding man in his 50s, his reading glasses slipping down his nose as he scribbled in a ledger. Ethan approached. Excuse me, I'm looking for records on a family that used to live here. The Whitakers. The man looked up, frowning. Whitaker. Yeah, they lived in Blackwood 15 years ago. Had a son, Daniel. The man's frown deepened. He tapped a pen against the desk, thinking. I've worked here for 20 years, he said finally. I don't recall any Whitakers. Ethan's stomach tightened. Can you check the records? The man sighed but nodded, disappearing into a back room. Minutes passed. Ethan drummed his fingers against the desk, watching dust dance in the slanted light. When the man returned, he carried a single yellowed folder. I don't have much, he admitted, setting it down. But this is all I could find. Ethan flipped it open, scanning the documents. Property records, census data. But something was off. The Whitaker house had existed. The address was listed, clear as day. But the owners? James and Lisa Morton. Ethan read aloud, his brow furrowed. Who the hell are they? The man shrugged. Only names listed at that property. No Whitakers. Ethan clenched his fists. He knew Daniel's family had lived there. He remembered sleepovers in his basement, riding bikes down Hollow Street, sneaking out to steal beers from Harper's older brother. But on paper, they had never existed. Something was wrong with this town. Very wrong. Ethan stormed into the Rusty Anchor just as Harper was cleaning up from the lunch rush. She took one look at him and sighed. You look like hell, she said, tossing a rag over her shoulder. Something is erasing people, Harper, he said, voice low. Not just their bodies, their existence. She didn't react, just poured him a drink. I told you, she said, sliding the glass across the bar. The hollow ones. Ethan swallowed hard. Why doesn't anyone fight back? Harper let out a humorless laugh. You don't fight them, Ethan. You either forget or you disappear. A chill crawled up his spine. She leaned in. Tell me something, she said. How long were you gone? 15 years, she nodded. And in all that time, how often did you think about Daniel? Ethan hesitated. He hadn't. Not really. There had been flashes. A dream here, a memory there. But he had never questioned why he didn't keep in touch. Why his childhood best friend had just faded from his life. Because that's how they work. They make you forget. Harper's expression softened. It's not your fault. It's what they do. Ethan gritted his teeth. Then how do we stop it? Harper hesitated. Finally, she said, there's someone who might be able to help, but you're not going to like it. That night, Harper led Ethan to the street. Augustine Church, a crumbling relic at the edge of town. Inside, the air smelled of wax and dust. Candles flickered along the altar, casting eerie shadows across the walls. An old man sat in a pew near the front, staring up at the stained glass with tired eyes. Father O'Brien. He turned as they approached, his lined face wary. I was wondering when you'd come, he said. Ethan frowned. You knew? Father O'Brien sighed. I've been waiting for someone like you for a long time. Ethan sat beside him. What do you know about the Hollow Ones? The old priest's expression darkened. They are not ghosts, he said. Not demons. They're voids. Empty spaces in reality, feeding on our memories. The more you remember the ones they take, the more they take you. Ethan's heart pounded. Then how do we fight them? Father O'Brien shook his head. You don't. You survive. You run. Ethan clenched his fists. That's not good enough. The priest studied him for a long moment, then exhaled. There is one way. Ethan leaned forward. You have to remember. Ethan frowned. What? Their power lies in forgetting. They erase people by erasing their story. If you can hold on to someone's memory, truly hold on, they can't take them completely. Harper paled. But that means... Father O'Brien nodded grimly. Yes, they'll come for you next. Silence. Ethan's mind raced. If remembering was the only way to stop them, then he had to remember Daniel. And if that meant the Hollow Ones would come for him, let them try. That night, Ethan sat in his childhood bedroom, every nerve in his body on edge. He clutched the Polaroid of him and Daniel, staring at the empty space where his friend should have been. I remember you, he whispered. A sharp pain stabbed behind his eyes. He groaned, clutching his head as his vision blurred. His reflection in the window shuddered, like a glitching video. A voice, soft, distant, whispered in his ear. Let go! Ethan's pulse thundered. The Polaroid trembled in his hands. And then, a shape appeared in the photo. Daniel, faint, barely there, but visible. Ethan gasped. His head throbbed, but he didn't care. He was pulling Daniel back. But then, outside his window, the fog rolled in, and standing in it were 5 faceless figures watching, waiting. The Hollow Ones had come for him. And this time, they weren't leaving empty-handed. Ethan could barely breathe. The Hollow Ones stood in the mist outside his window, watching. Their bodies were thin, too tall, their movements wrong, like marionettes whose strings had been cut. But it was their faces, or rather the absence of them, that made Ethan's stomach churn. Their heads were smooth, featureless voids like black holes in human form. And they were waiting. The Polaroid in Ethan's hand shook. His fingers felt numb. The air in the room heavier than before. He glanced down at the photo. Daniel's image had begun to fade again. No! Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, focusing. I remember you. The photo flickered, like something glitching in and out of existence. Outside, the Hollow Ones took a step closer. Ethan's heart pounded. He had spent the last 24 hours fighting to prove Daniel existed, to prove he wasn't insane. And now, something wrong was standing in the fog, watching him unravel. He backed away from the window, pulse hammering. He needed to get out of here. Something knocked against the glass. Not a fist, not a hand, a slow, deliberate tap. Ethan's breath hitched. Another tap, then a third, and finally, a voice. Distant, hollow. Let go. The words slithered into his ears like oil. The temperature in the room plummeted. Ethan's breath misted in the air, his skin pebbling with goosebumps. The Hollow Ones didn't move, but somehow they felt closer. They wanted him to forget. And if he did, if he let Daniel slip away, they would leave him alone. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Screw that. He turned, grabbed his jacket, and bolted for the door. 15 minutes later, Ethan was standing outside street. Augustine Church, fists banging against the heavy wooden doors. The town was empty. No cars on the road. No voices in the distance. Just a thick fog rolling over the streets like a living thing. A full minute passed before the door groaned open. Father O'Brien stood in the entryway, looking even older than he had the night before. His eyes flicked past Ethan, scanning the mist. "They're following you," he muttered. Ethan pushed inside. No kidding. The church was dimly lit, candles casting flickering shadows along the high stone walls. The scent of incense and old wood filled the air. Father O'Brien locked the door behind them. "You saw them, didn't you?" Ethan nodded. "And they saw me." The priest exhaled. "Then you don't have much time." Ethan slammed the Polaroid onto a pew. "I made him come back," he said. "Daniel, I saw him. For a second, he was there again." Father O'Brien picked up the photo, studying it. "This is dangerous," he murmured. "The more you fight them, the harder they pull." "I don't care," Ethan said. "How do I stop them?" Father O'Brien hesitated. Then he placed a hand on the worn wooden pew, fingers tightening like he was holding something back. "There's an old place," he said finally, "near the cliffs, the Hollow Street Chapel." Ethan frowned. "Never heard of it." "You wouldn't have," the priest said. "It was abandoned before you were born, but it's where the Hollow Ones first came through." Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Came through from where?" Father O'Brien's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know, and I don't think anyone ever did." Ethan took a step closer. "If that's where they started, maybe that's where we can end this." The priest sighed. "No one who's gone looking for answers has ever come back." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then it's time someone did." Ethan wasn't alone when he reached the chapel. Harper was already there, leaning against her car, arms crossed. "You're a dumbass, you know that," she said. Ethan smirked. "Nice to see you too." She sighed. "I figured you'd come here. Didn't want you getting yourself erased before you bought me a drink." Ethan glanced up at the Hollow Street Chapel. It was a wreck. The wooden structure sagged inward, its steeple cracked and leaning. The stained glass windows had been shattered long ago, leaving empty frames like gaping mouths. The doors hung slightly open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Harper followed his gaze. "So, what's the plan?" Ethan exhaled. "Go in, find out what's tying these things to Blackwood, and burn the place down if we have to." Harper arched an eyebrow. "Solid. I'll add blind optimism to the list of reasons you'll get yourself killed." Ethan smirked. "You worried about me?" She rolled her eyes. "Shut up and walk." Together, they stepped inside. The inside of the chapel was worse than Ethan expected. The wooden pews were rotting, the floorboards warped from years of neglect. Mold crept up the stone walls, and a horrible smell filled the air, like something dead had been left to fester. At the far end of the chapel, a single book rested on the pulpit. Ethan and Harper exchanged a glance. "You want to read the cursed book first, or should I?" Harper muttered. Ethan ignored her and picked it up. The cover was black leather, faded with time. The pages inside were handwritten in a shaky scrawl. "Journal of Father Elias Mercer, 1893. Ethan turned the pages, reading aloud. "The Hollow Ones came in the fog. They whispered to us, offered us a bargain. To forget, to let go. We did not understand the price." Harper shivered. "Well, that's comforting." Ethan flipped further. "The more we forgot, the stronger they became. They fed on our memories, our history. And in return, we were left with peace. No grief, no loss, only emptiness." His stomach turned. "They don't just take people. They take pain." The town gave them memories in exchange for forgetting. Harper shook her head. "That's insane." Ethan swallowed. "It worked, didn't it? No one in Blackwood remembers the ones they lost. No mourning, nobody, just nothing." Harper's face paled. "Except us?" A cold wind blew through the chapel. The candles flickered. Ethan's hands froze over the pages. Harper grabbed his arm. "Ethan," a whisper slithered through the air. "Let go." The shadows in the room shifted. The pews groaned. Ethan turned and saw them. The Hollow Ones stood in the chapel, watching, waiting, and this time, they weren't just whispering. They were coming. The fog poured into the chapel like a flood. Ethan grabbed Harper's hand and ran. The Hollow Ones moved faster than before, their bodies glitching in and out of the mist. The walls of the chapel warped, stretching like they were made of melting wax. Ethan stumbled toward the pulpit, gripping the journal like a lifeline. "If they feed on forgetting, then we have to remember." He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing memories to the surface. Daniel's laughter, the nights sneaking out, the way he used to swear he'd leave this town, just like Ethan had. "I remember you," Ethan shouted. The hollow one shrieked. The fog shook, and for the first time one of them split apart. Its body tore open, unraveling like threads being pulled from fabric. Inside, there was nothing, just empty space. Harper yanked Ethan back. "Holy!" The chapel shuddered. The hollow ones let out a final, furious wail. And then they vanished. The fog thinned. The silence returned. Ethan and Harper gasped for breath, staring at the empty space where the creatures had stood. And behind them, the Polaroid in Ethan's pocket had changed. Daniel Whitaker was back, and he was smiling. Ethan sat in his childhood bedroom, staring at the Polaroid in his hands. Daniel Whitaker was back. The once empty space in the photo now held the face of his best friend, smiling, alive, real. But something was wrong. The longer Ethan looked at the image, the more details seemed off. The color of Daniel's shirt kept shifting in his memory, blue or red. His smile flickered between a grin and something unreadable. The background of the picture, once familiar, now felt like a place Ethan didn't recognize. And worst of all, he couldn't remember the last time they spoke. Not before he left Blackwood. Not the goodbye. Not a single word. Had Daniel even been there? Or had Ethan forced him back into existence? His stomach twisted. Something had changed. And it wasn't over. Harper slammed a newspaper onto the bar. "Tell me what's wrong with this picture," she said. Ethan rubbed his temple. After the chaos of last night, he hadn't slept. His head felt like someone had taken a hammer to his skull. He squinted at the paper. It was the Blackwood Gazette, dated September 7th. "Except, that's impossible," Ethan muttered. "Yesterday was the 4th. Harper nodded grimly. "Looks like we lost 3 days. Ethan's blood ran cold. He flipped through the pages, scanning headlines, searching for something, anything that might explain the missing time. But it was all normal. Local news, a high school football game recap, some town hall meeting. Nothing about the hollow ones. Nothing about them disappearing. Nothing about Daniel returning. Ethan pulled out the Polaroid, his hands clammy. Daniel's face was still there. So, why didn't it feel like a victory? Harper drummed her fingers on the counter. "We need to talk to someone who can give us answers. Real answers." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Father O'Brien?" Harper hesitated. "No." She slid a slip of paper across the bar. It was an address. No name. Just a street outside of town. Ethan frowned. "Who lives here?" Harper took a sip of whiskey before answering. "The only person who ever escaped the hollow ones. The drive took them 2 hours out of Blackwood, deep into the Maine wilderness. The house sat alone at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by dead trees. The place had the look of something forgotten. Shutters barely hanging on, weeds strangling the front porch, a wind chime made of rusted bones swaying in the breeze." Ethan parked, glancing at Harper. "You sure about this?" "No." She climbed out. "But I've got a gun, so let's find out." They stepped onto the porch, and Harper knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. Silence. Then, shuffling from inside, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his 70s, thin as a skeleton, with wild gray hair and deep-set eyes. He smelled like dust and decay. His gaze darted between them. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "It's happening again." Harper crossed her arms. "Nice to see you too, Joe." Ethan blinked. "Wait, you know this guy?" Harper sighed. "Ethan, meet Joseph Mallory. My mom's uncle." Ethan's stomach dropped. Mallory. He recognized the name. As kids, they had whispered about crazy old Joe in hushed voices. The man who had claimed his family vanished overnight. Who had ranted about people being erased, about a town that let it happen. Nobody had believed him. Now Ethan did. Inside, the house was a disaster. Piles of yellowed newspapers, faded photographs pinned to the walls, strings connecting maps like some insane detective's murder board. Joe paced, muttering under his breath. "They took my wife first," he said, voice hoarse. "Then my son, and then they took my damn memories." He stopped, pointing a shaking finger at them. "You don't understand, boy. The hollow ones don't just erase people. They erase time." Ethan felt a cold weight settle in his gut. Joe continued, "They don't kill. They don't leave bodies. They consume the past. If you forget someone existed, then they never did. The world bends around the missing piece, and everything moves on like they were never here." Ethan's throat went dry. "But I remember Daniel. I brought him back." Joe's face twisted into something like pity. "Did you?" Ethan faltered. Harper shifted uncomfortably. "He has a photo. Proof." Joe let out a short, humorless laugh. "A photo?" He turned to a stack of old Polaroids and grabbed one. shoving it into Ethan's hands. It was a picture of a woman. Dark hair, soft smile. She looked familiar, almost. "This was my wife," Joe said. His voice cracked. "I fought to remember her. I kept her picture, and you know what?" Ethan looked closer and felt his stomach drop. The edges of the woman's face were blurred, like something was pushing her out of reality, like she was becoming hollow. Joe's hands trembled. They don't like being defied, boy. And when you force something back that they took. His eyes met Ethan's. They take it again. Ethan drove back to Blackwood in silence. Harper stared out the window, arms crossed, chewing the inside of her cheek. Joe's words echoed in Ethan's head. When you force something back, they take it again. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He wouldn't let that happen. But as they reached the outskirts of town, Ethan froze. The road signs were missing. No welcome to Blackwood. No street names. No mile markers. Like the town was fading. Harper sat up. What the hell? Ethan gritted his teeth. It's starting. The hollow ones weren't gone. They were just waiting. And now, they were erasing everything. The forgotten town when they arrived in Blackwood. The streets were empty. The diner? Closed. The library? Gone. Even the rusty anchor was dark. The sign missing from the front. Harper's voice shook. Where the hell is everyone? Ethan pulled out his phone, heart hammering. He dialed Father O'Brien. No answer. He called every number in his contacts. No signal. The town was vanishing. He pulled the Polaroid from his pocket, desperate. Daniel was still there, still smiling, but his eyes were gone. Two black, empty voids. Ethan's breath hitched. The hollow ones weren't just erasing Daniel. They were erasing everything around him. And if Ethan didn't stop it soon, Blackwood would disappear forever. The town was dying. Ethan could feel it. Blackwood streets, once familiar, now felt like an echo. Something slipping from reality, just beyond his grasp. Buildings flickered at the edges of his vision, like static on an old TV screen. The library was gone. The diner was gone. Street signs had vanished entirely. It wasn't just people the hollow ones erased. It was everything. Harper stood beside him in the middle of Main Street, fists clenched at her sides. She had been silent since they got back, but now she turned to him, her jaw tight. "We have to find someone." "Anyone." Ethan nodded, but in his gut, he already knew the truth. There was no one left. The town was empty, and it was about to get worse. They started at Street, Augustine Church. The wooden doors were inside. The candles had burned down to wax puddles. Father O'Brien was nowhere. Ethan walked cautiously down the aisle, his breath echoing in the cavernous space. His stomach twisted. Had the hollow ones taken him? Or had he simply ceased to be? Harper picked up a discarded Bible from the floor. The pages inside were blank. She cursed under her breath. "They're wiping the whole damn town." Ethan exhaled sharply. "Then we need to move faster." They turned to leave, and that was when they saw him. A man stood in the church doorway, half hidden by fog. He was not from Blackwood. Ethan knew every face in town, and this one was unfamiliar. Pale, sunken eyes, a thin frame that seemed wrong in the dim light. But it wasn't his face that made Ethan's pulse spike. It was his shadow, or rather, the lack of one. The man tilted his head. His lips curled into a too-wide grin. "You've been looking for answers," he said. His voice was smooth, too perfect. Harper's hand went to the knife in her belt. Ethan swallowed. "Who are you?" The man stepped closer. "I am a witness," he said. "One who remembers what has been lost." Ethan and Harper exchanged a glance. "Then tell us," Ethan said. "What the hell is happening?" The man's smile widened. "They're almost finished," he murmured. "And once they are, there will be no town, no history, no you." Harper stiffened. "You mean?" "Yes," the man whispered. "Blackwood will never have existed at all." Ethan's stomach twisted. Blackwood, it was being undone. Every person, every building, every memory. The hollow ones weren't taking pieces anymore. They were resetting the board. Harper took a step forward. "Why?" she demanded. "Why this town? Why now?" The man gave her a curious look. "Because you started remembering." The words slammed into Ethan like a punch. He had done this. He had forced Daniel back. And the hollow ones didn't like unfinished work. He took a shaky breath. "Then how do we stop it?" The witness studied him for a long moment. "There is a way," he said. "A bargain." Ethan's pulse pounded. "What kind of bargain?" The man's too wide smile returned. "One must take the place of those who were erased." Ethan felt Harper stiffen beside him. The witness continued. "The hollow ones do not create. They only consume, but they will allow a trade. One life for all the others." The air turned heavy. The meaning was clear. One of them would have to take Daniel's place, or the town would be erased forever. Ethan and Harper sat in his mother's house, the silence thick between them. The witnesses' offer loomed over them. Ethan turned the Polaroid in his hands. Daniel's face was still there, but now his mouth was missing. His expression looked wrong, like it had been stretched into something unnatural. Harper broke the silence. "This is bullshit." Ethan glanced at her. "We don't make deals with monsters," she said. "We find another way." Ethan wanted to agree. He wanted to believe there was another way. But time was running out, and Blackwood was almost gone. A flicker of movement outside caught his attention. The fog was thickening, and within it, the Hollow Ones watched, waiting. Harper saw them too. She reached for her gun, but Ethan grabbed her wrist. "No," he whispered. "They're trying to push us into the deal." Harper's jaw tightened. Ethan turned back to the Polaroid. Daniel had been taken. Now, the Hollow Ones were offering a way out. But was it real? Or was it just another trap? They drove to the Whitaker house, or where it used to be. The empty lot was surrounded by thick fog, swirling like a living thing. Ethan's hands were clammy as he gripped the journal from the chapel. Inside, Father Mercer had written about something called the Hollowing Ritual. To reverse the erasure, one must enter the space where the lost were taken and force the memory back. It was risky, but it was better than making a deal. Harper knelt beside him, drawing a circle in the dirt with a silver knife. "If this doesn't work," she muttered, "I'm punching you in the afterlife." Ethan smirked. "Fair." The fog thickened, and then the Hollow One stepped forward. Tall, silent, featureless, a whisper slithered through the air. "Choose." Ethan closed his eyes. He focused. Memories flashed through his mind. Daniel's laugh. The way he ran faster than anyone in school. The night they carved their initials into the diner's table. "I remember you," Ethan whispered. The Hollow One shuddered. The fog boiled. Harper pressed the knife into her palm, drawing blood. She dragged it across the dirt, completing the ritual. The Hollow One screamed. Ethan felt something snap, like the air had been sucked from the world. And then the fog recoiled. The Hollow Ones vanished, and the town began to return. Ethan gasped, his body aching. Harper sat beside him, panting. "Did it work?" Ethan turned to the Polaroid. Daniel was there. His face was whole again, but something was wrong. The background had changed. Instead of the street outside Ethan's childhood home, the Polaroid now showed somewhere else. A black void. Daniel's expression had changed. Not a smile, not relief, but horror, like he was trapped on the other side. Ethan's blood ran cold. He had brought Daniel back, but not all the way. The Hollow Ones had left something behind. A whisper slithered through the night. Not finished, and then everything went silent. Ethan and Harper exchanged a look. This wasn't over. Not yet. The first thing Ethan noticed when he woke up was the silence. It wasn't the comforting kind. The kind that came with early mornings or snow-covered streets. This silence felt wrong, as if the world had been stripped of something important, but he couldn't figure out what. He sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes. His body ached like he had run for miles, and his head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then it hit him. The Hollow Ones. The ritual. Daniel. His stomach turned as he fumbled for the Polaroid on the nightstand. His fingers trembled as he flipped it over. Daniel's face was still there, but his eyes were pleading now. His mouth was open in a silent scream, as if he were trapped behind glass, pounding to get out. Ethan swallowed hard. He had saved him, hadn't he? The whisper of a thought, one he didn't want to acknowledge, crept into his mind. What if Daniel wasn't back? What if Ethan had only pulled back the idea of Daniel, while the real one remained lost? A chill crawled up his spine. Then he realized something else. The town was too quiet. Even in the early morning, there should have been the distant hum of life. Birds, the occasional car, the rustling of trees in the wind. But there was nothing. Harper. He needed to find Harper. Ethan stepped outside, gripping his jacket against the creeping cold. Blackwood looked normal, but in the way that a wax figure looked human. It was familiar, but off. There were no cars on the streets, no people walking their dogs, no distant murmur of conversation. The rusty anchor was dark, its neon sign shattered. The library, which had reappeared after the ritual, now looked abandoned again, its front doors hanging open like a gaping mouth. It was as if the town was waiting, or worse, watching. Ethan's chest tightened. He started toward Harper's apartment, his footsteps too loud on the pavement. The air felt thick, the kind of heaviness that came before a storm. He reached the door and knocked. No answer. His stomach twisted. He knocked again, harder this time, still nothing. Ethan cursed under his breath and tried the handle. It turned, the door swung open, revealing an empty apartment. Harper was gone. Not just gone, erased. Ethan staggered back. No, he whispered. His heart pounded as he ran inside, searching for anything that proved Harper had been here. But the apartment was wrong. The walls were blank. No posters, no photos, no personal touches. The furniture was there, but it felt staged like a model home. The fridge was empty. The closet held clothes that weren't hers. Neutral colors, lifeless styles, like they had been placed there just to fill space. There was no trace of her. Ethan clenched his fists. This wasn't like Daniel. This was happening now. She had been here yesterday. She had fought beside him. They had performed the ritual together. So why was she gone? Why wasn't he forgetting her like he had with Daniel? Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed her number. The call went through. It rang and rang and rang. Then a click. A voice answered. But it wasn't Harper. Hello. The voice was flat. Male. Wrong. Ethan's throat tightened. Who is this? A pause. Then, there is no Harper Lane. The call cut out. Ethan stared at the screen, his breath coming in short gasps. He felt like he was going to be sick. The hollow ones weren't just removing people now. They were replacing them. Ethan didn't know where else to go, so he went to the one place that might still hold answers. Street, Augustine Church. The wooden doors were closed, but they didn't look right. They were too clean, like they had been rebuilt overnight. Ethan hesitated, then pushed them open. Inside, Father O'Brien was waiting for him. Ethan let out a breath of relief. Thank God. The priest smiled warmly. Ethan, my son, you look troubled. Ethan frowned. Something was wrong. Father O'Brien's robes were pristine. His face was too smooth, his eyes too bright. And then Ethan noticed the cross hanging on the wall behind him. It was upside down. His stomach dropped. You're not him, Ethan whispered. Father O'Brien tilted his head. His smile never wavered. Neither are you. Ethan stumbled back. The priest took a step forward. This town is ours now, he murmured. You can still join us. You don't have to fight. You don't have to remember. His eyes flickered, just for a second. And in that moment, Ethan saw what was really standing there. Not Father O'Brien. Not a man, but a hollow one wearing his face. Ethan turned and ran. The streets were closing in. Buildings flickered, appearing, disappearing, shifting in and out of reality. The sky darkened, the fog growing thicker, swallowing everything in sight. Ethan reached his mother's house, barely able to breathe. The walls shimmered as if they weren't fully real anymore. His hands trembled as he pulled out the Polaroid. Daniel's face was still there, but now so was Harper's. Her mouth was open in a silent scream, just like Daniel's. Ethan felt something snap inside him. They weren't just taking people, they were collecting them. He clenched his jaw. If Harper was in the photo, if Daniel had been there before, then maybe, just maybe, there was a way to pull them back. But it would come at a price. The hollow ones weren't finished yet, and Ethan Graves was the last person left to erase. A whisper slithered through the room. It's time. The lights flickered, and the hollow ones stepped through the walls. Ethan staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. The hollow ones had stepped through the walls of his childhood home, their featureless heads tilting at unnatural angles. Their bodies were impossibly thin, stretched like shadows in the dim light. The room shuddered. The furniture around him flickered. One moment solid, the next moment hazy, half erased. They were unmaking the house, and him along with it. Ethan gripped the Polaroid in his trembling hands. Daniel's face, Harper's face, both there, but not whole. Their eyes were wide, mouths frozen mid-scream. They weren't just gone, they were trapped. A cold whisper slithered through the room. You do not belong. Ethan's pulse pounded. The hollow ones were erasing the last witness, and he was running out of time. Ethan bolted for the door. The air felt like molasses, heavy and slow, pulling him down. The moment his fingers touched the doorknob, it disintegrated into dust. Panic gripped his chest. He turned back. The hollow ones watched him in eerie silence. The walls of the house peeled away, like paper curling in a fire. The outside world flickered. The street was no longer there. There was only fog, and beyond it blackness. Not the darkness of night. A void. A place where nothing had ever existed. Ethan swallowed hard. They weren't just erasing him. They were erasing everything. A sharp crack rang through the air. The ceiling buckled, splintering like rotting wood. The floor beneath Ethan's feet warped, stretching away from him, turning his childhood home into a surreal, shifting maze. The hollow ones didn't move. They didn't have to. The world was collapsing around them, rewriting itself in their favor. Ethan's vision blurred. His own hands were starting to flicker. His memories splintered. He could barely remember why he was running. He could barely remember his own name. "No," he whispered. "Not like this." Something cold and sharp pressed against his skull. A memory. Not his. Harper's and Daniel's. For a brief, fleeting second, he could hear their voices. Not whispers, not echoes, but real. "Ethan, don't forget us?" His vision snapped back into focus, and he ran for the stairs. Ethan reached the second floor, except it wasn't the second floor anymore. The hallway stretched too far, bending into darkness. The doors to the bedrooms were gone, replaced with a single, massive door at the very end. And it was open. Fog spilled out from the threshold, swallowing the floorboards beneath his feet. Beyond the door, Ethan saw something that made his stomach lurch. A town, Blackwood, but not as it was now. It was frozen in time. The diner was still open, its neon sign glowing faintly. The streets were full of people, faces Ethan barely remembered from childhood. A version of Blackwood before the hollow ones had erased it. Ethan staggered back. This wasn't the real town. This was the place where the lost had gone. Harper, Daniel, his mother, every erased soul was here, and the hollow ones wanted him to join them. Ethan stepped through the door, and the world shifted. Suddenly, he was standing in the middle of Main Street. Except it wasn't his main street. It was too bright, too still, like a preserved photograph. The sky overhead was locked in permanent twilight, a dull gray that never darkened or lightened. The air didn't move. The people around him walked like shadows, repeating loops of actions. Entering the diner, sitting down, ordering food but never eating. Others wandered, faces blank, going nowhere. Daniel was nowhere to be seen. Neither was Harper. Ethan's jaw tightened. This wasn't real. It was a prison, a place where the erased wandered forever. And if he stayed too long, he would forget why he ever tried to leave. A soft voice spoke behind him. "You don't have to fight anymore, Ethan." He turned and froze. His mother stood there, alive, smiling. She looked exactly as she had before she died. Her soft blue eyes, the silver strands in her hair. She reached for him, warmth in her expression. "You can stay," she whispered. "We can all be together again." Ethan's chest tightened. A part of him, a desperate, breaking part of him, wanted to believe it. Wanted to believe that she had never really died. Wanted to believe this was real. But it wasn't. His mother was gone, and the thing standing in front of him wasn't her. It was them. A hollow one wearing her face. His mother's smile began to widen, too wide. Her lips stretched past her cheeks, splitting open like a wound, her blue eyes darkening into empty voids. And then, in a whisper just like his mother's voice, it spoke. "Forget." Ethan clenched his jaw and ripped the Polaroid in half. A sound like shattering glass filled the air. The town trembled. The hollow one screamed. A noise that wasn't a sound, but a wound in reality itself. The false city around Ethan collapsed, like sand crumbling into an abyss. The sky darkened. The trapped souls flickered, their frozen movements breaking. And then Daniel appeared. Not in the distance, not in the photograph. Real, alive. His face was pale, his body thin, like he had been starving for years. But his eyes, his real, human eyes, locked onto Ethan's. "Ethan," Daniel whispered. "You pulled me back." Ethan's throat tightened. "I told you I wouldn't forget." A hand shot out from the fog. Not human. A hollow one lunged, its body stretching like a nightmare. Shrieking, Daniel grabbed Ethan's wrist, and the world broke apart. Ethan gasped as he hit solid ground. Not fog, not void, but asphalt. His lungs burned. His heart slammed against his ribs. He looked up and saw Blackwood. The real Blackwood. Not perfect, not frozen in time, but real. The sky was dark with early morning. The rusty anchor stood exactly as it always had, its sign flickering, parking lot empty. Harper sat beside him, coughing, alive, and Daniel, the real Daniel, was slumped against the pavement, breathing hard. Ethan's hands trembled. He turned to Harper. Her expression was unreadable. Then she exhaled sharply. "Well," she muttered, "that was some bullshit." Ethan laughed, a raw, broken, relieved laugh. They had won, but something still nagged at the back of his mind. Slowly, he turned to Daniel. Daniel met his gaze, swallowing hard. And then, in a hoarse whisper, he said, "They're not gone." Daniel's words hit like a gunshot in the dark. "They're not gone." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His muscles tensed as he turned toward Daniel. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked like a man who had crawled out of a grave. His skin pale, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling as if he had been freezing for years. But there was no hesitation when he nodded. "I can still feel them," he said. "Like they're waiting, watching." Harper ran a hand through her tangled hair. "You've got to be kidding me. We burned their nest down. We broke their stupid town. We even dragged his ass back from the void. What the hell else do they want?" Daniel hesitated. Ethan already knew the answer. "They want me." The words felt heavy, final. Daniel looked down, jaw tight. Harper cursed under her breath. Ethan exhaled sharply, looking around. Blackwood was still standing. The sky was its usual overcast gray, the scent of wet asphalt lingering in the air. The Hollow Street Chapel was gone, reduced to nothing but scorched earth. The fog had lifted. The town had survived, and yet it still felt wrong, like something was missing. Not a person, not a building, something deeper. And then a sound cut through the silence. A single, distant knock. Not at a door, not on glass, but inside Ethan's head. His stomach twisted. The hollow ones weren't gone. They were inside him now. Ethan stumbled backward, his vision flickering at the edges. He felt light, like his body was becoming less real by the second. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. He pressed his fingers against his temples. A second knock sounded, louder this time. Daniel grabbed his shoulder. "Ethan," but the moment he touched him, Daniel flickered, his face distorting for a brief second, his entire existence trembling like a weak radio signal. Ethan recoiled in horror. It wasn't Daniel who was vanishing. It was him. Harper's face paled. "Ethan, what the hell is happening?" Ethan gritted his teeth. "They don't just erase people," he said. "They replace them." Harper's mouth opened, then closed. She understood. Daniel had come back, and now the hollow ones were taking Ethan in return. It was a trade, and it had already started. "We need to stop this," Harper said, her voice sharper now. "Fast." Ethan nodded, fighting the pull. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, gravity slowly tipping him forward. His thoughts were slipping, unraveling thread by thread. He wouldn't let them take him. He wouldn't forget himself. There had to be a way out. And then a memory surfaced. Joe Mallory, the old man, the only one who had escaped the hollow ones before. He had told them, "They don't create. They only consume, but they will allow a trade." A trade. Ethan's pulse pounded. What if he could reverse the deal? What if, instead of him being taken, he could send them back instead? Harper drove like a bat out of hell, gravel spitting from the tires as they tore down the back roads toward Joe Mallory's house. Daniel sat in the back seat, his hands clenching and unclenching like he was fighting the feeling of being real again. Ethan, meanwhile, was fading fast. His reflection in the car window was blurry, like an unfinished painting. His voice sounded distant, like he was speaking from another room. He didn't have much time. Harper slammed on the brakes outside Joe's cabin. The three of them burst inside without knocking. Joe was already waiting for them. "I told you," he rasped, eyes dark with exhaustion. "They always take something back." Ethan leaned against the wall, trying to steady himself. "There's got to be a way to stop them." Joe exhaled, rubbing his face. "There is." He turned and pulled a rusted tin box from beneath the floorboards. He opened it, revealing an old leather journal. Pages yellowed, filled with handwritten symbols. Ethan recognized them. They were the same ones from the Hollow Street Chapel. Father Mercer's writings. Joe flipped to a page, his finger tracing the words. "The hollow ones don't just take memories," he said. "They take names." Ethan's breath hitched. Names? That's why no one remembered the erased. Because once the hollow ones took their name, they were gone. Joe met Ethan's gaze. "If we can bind them back to their own names, we can lock them away." Ethan nodded. That was all he needed to hear. The ritual was set in motion. Ethan sat in the center of Joe's cabin, the Polaroid resting in front of him. Harper and Daniel lit 4 black candles, placing them at the corners of a chalk-drawn circle. Joe muttered in Latin under his breath. The air shifted thick, charged with static. The hollow ones were listening. Ethan closed his eyes, his pulse pounding. He focused, not on forgetting, but on remembering. All the names the hollow ones had taken. Daniel Whitaker, Harper Lane, Father O'Brien, Joe's wife, every soul who had been erased. Ethan spoke their names aloud, and as he did, the cabin trembled. A horrible wailing sound filled the air, like a dozen voices shrieking at once. The Polaroid on the floor curled at the edges, the images inside twisting. They were fighting back. The hollow ones were afraid, and Ethan finally understood why. Because as long as someone remembered them, they could never truly win. The walls of the cabin shook violently, books toppling from shelves. The candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching unnaturally. A voice whispered from the shadows, "Let go, Ethan." Ethan gritted his teeth. No, the Polaroid burned in the fire, the images inside melting away, and as the last embers flickered, the hollow one screamed. The entire cabin shook, and then silence. The static in the air vanished. The heavy, pressing weight of the hollow ones was gone. Ethan gasped, his entire body trembling. He looked at his hands, solid, real. Harper exhaled loudly, rubbing her face. Jesus Christ. Daniel sat on the floor, staring at his own hands like he wasn't sure they belonged to him. And Joe? He just nodded. "They're locked away now," he muttered. "For good if we're lucky." Ethan let out a slow, shaky breath. They had won. Blackwood was still standing the next morning. People were back. The buildings were normal. The fog was gone. Harper sat beside Ethan on the steps of the Rusty Anchor, sipping a beer. "Well," she muttered, "that sucked." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah." Daniel sat on the curb, watching the cars pass by. He was here, whole, alive. Ethan looked at his hands one last time. Still real, still himself. No more hollow ones. No more whispers. It was over. But as he looked at the horizon, a cold thought crept into his mind. Joe had said they were locked away, not destroyed. And if they could be locked away, they could be freed again. Ethan took a slow breath. Next time they wouldn't be caught off guard, because now they remembered, and the hollow ones could never erase them again. Ethan Graves was supposed to be safe. The hollow ones were gone, locked away, forgotten. And yet, as he stood at the edge of Blackwood, watching the last of the autumn leaves drift across the pavement, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. Not the town, not the people, himself. For the past 3 days, Ethan had felt lighter, like a piece of him had been cut away without his permission. He was here alive, standing in a town that should have been erased, but something was wrong. Harper noticed at first. "You're quieter," she had said yesterday. "Less." There, and Daniel, who shouldn't even exist anymore, had given him a strange look. "Do you feel different?" Ethan had shrugged, brushed it off, but deep down he knew the hollow ones hadn't taken him, but they had left a hole, and something was waiting to fill it. The Rusty Anchor was busier than it had been in weeks. The town was alive again, unaware of how close it had come to never existing at all. People laughed, clinked glasses, gossiped about the same meaningless things they always had. To them, nothing had changed. But Ethan felt it. There was a gap where something should have been, and the longer he ignored it, the wider it got. He nursed a drink at the bar, staring into the amber liquid like it held answers. Harper leaned against the counter beside him, eyeing him warily. "You good?" Ethan exhaled, not sure. Harper studied him. She had seen him at his worst, on the brink of being erased, pulling Daniel back from nothing, standing in the hollowed-out corpse of Blackwood's past. But this was different. This wasn't fear. This was loss. She set her drink down. "Okay, talk to me." Ethan hesitated. How could he explain something he couldn't even define? It's like he frowned, searching for the right words. "I know I'm here. I know I'm real, but it feels like I left something behind." Harper was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you think they took part of you?" Ethan's grip tightened around his glass. "I don't know, but deep down he did." The hollow ones hadn't left empty-handed. They had taken something from him, and whatever it was trying to pull him back. Ethan left the bar just after midnight. Blackwood was silent, the cold air biting at his skin. The streetlights flickered faintly, their glow barely cutting through the night. He heard footsteps behind him. Daniel. Ethan slowed as his friend caught up, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. "You're acting weird," Daniel said. Ethan huffed a quiet laugh. "That's rich, coming from a guy who spent 15 years trapped in a memory prison." Daniel didn't smile. "I'm serious." Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know, He trailed off. How could he explain the feeling of being incomplete, of standing in a world that no longer felt like his own? Daniel watched him carefully. "You ever hear of survivor's guilt?" Ethan frowned. "Yeah, why?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "Maybe that's what this is. You brought me back, Ethan. You pulled me out of whatever the hell that place was. But you were supposed to be the one who disappeared." Ethan stiffened. Daniel swallowed. "The hollow ones expected you." The word sent a cold shiver down Ethan's spine. He thought about the knock in his head, the feeling of something waiting. They hadn't taken him when they had the chance. But what if they were still trying to claim him? What if he was already slipping away? Ethan didn't go home. He couldn't shake the feeling that if he went back to his mother's house, if he closed his eyes, if he let the silence take over, he wouldn't wake up. So he drove, past the diner, past the library, past the Hollow Street Chapel, which was now nothing more than burned earth. He parked outside the empty lot and stared at the blackened ground. This was where it had all started, where they had crossed over, where Ethan had pulled Daniel back. His hands clenched the steering wheel. Something wasn't finished. He knew it, and the longer he stayed in Blackwood, the worse it got. His memories were already shifting. Tiny things. He had tried to call his mother's lawyer earlier, only to realize he couldn't remember his name. He had driven past his childhood school, only to realize he couldn't remember what grade he had been in when he left. The Hollow Ones hadn't just taken something from him. They had left something behind, and it was spreading. The knock came again. This time, it wasn't inside his head. It was on the car window. Ethan froze. The passenger seat was empty, but outside, standing in the burned lot, was a man in a gray suit. Ethan's stomach dropped, not because he recognized him, but because he should have. The man smiled faintly. "You figured it out, didn't you?" Ethan's throat tightened. "Figured out what?" The man gestured at the empty space where the chapel had stood. "You were supposed to be gone." Ethan's hands trembled. The air around the man shimmered like static on an old TV. Ethan had seen that before. In the Hollow Ones, he swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The man's smile didn't change. "I'm the one who remembers you, Ethan." Ethan's breath hitched. The man tilted his head. "But if you want to stay, I can forget you too." Ethan's blood ran cold. That was the choice, wasn't it? He had pulled Daniel back. He had broken the cycle. But the Hollow Ones still needed to take someone. And if Ethan refused, they would never stop. Ethan looked at the town behind him. The life he had rebuilt. Harper, Daniel, everything that should have been erased. He had won. He had fought against the Hollow Ones and dragged the lost back into the light. And yet, he still felt like a man who shouldn't be here. Like a shadow of himself. He turned back to the man in gray. The Hollow One smiled, waiting. And Ethan finally understood. This wasn't about death. This wasn't about survival. This was about who got to exist. The Hollow Ones had let him walk away. For now. But if he stayed, if he clung to a life that had already been rewritten, they would come back. For Harper. For Daniel. For Blackwood. His real choice wasn't about saving himself. It was about saving them. Ethan took a slow, steady breath. And then he stepped into the burn lot. The Hollow One nodded approvingly. And as Ethan's name faded from the world, he smiled. A week later, a journalist from out of town came to Blackwood. She was investigating a strange disappearance. A man named Ethan Graves. Except nobody remembered him. Not the bartender at the Rusty Anchor. Not the people who had lived here for decades. Not even Daniel Whitaker. Only Harper Lane hesitated when asked. For a second, just a second, her brow furrowed, like she was trying to recall something. But then she blinked, and the memory was gone.